Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is The 1920s. Let's get into it. All right. The 1920s is a really interesting decade because it's one of those decades within kind of the arc of American history where there can be this nostalgia for aspects of American pop culture. This sort of looking back and kind of wonderment of, oh, that could have been cool. That could have been interesting. And sure, at the time, the new introduction of radio, right? That was interesting. The growth and popularity of baseball with figures like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig were interesting. The rise of Hollywood and films was interesting. But let's recognize the kind of myth versus reality. That for as much as those things would be interesting, we have to acknowledge that the most popular community organization in America in the 1920s was the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, and so to understand the 1920s is to understand kind of the multifaceted nature of what that decade really was. It was a decade of multiple sort of ways of experiencing America. So one of them would have been kind of the political upheaval that happened both in the U.S. and globally in the aftermath of World War I. 1919 was a period of rising political sort of upheaval, and you have strikes as well. You have a lot going on. The 1920s is a period of profound racial conflict. The Tulsa massacre that happens in the early 1920s should be acknowledged. Secondly, it is the period of Prohibition, right? It is the period of Prohibition. So you have the Volstead Act, and you have federal officers who are involved in the enforcement of Prohibition, but you also have gangs and figures throughout the country, especially, yes, in places like Chicago, that are centered on trafficking in the sale of alcohol, and violence ensues. So Al Capone would be, of course, a big leader in this, but there are others nationwide. Again, racial conflict and racial violence. You have opposition to immigration. You have laws passed in 1921 and again in 1924. Eugenics is kind of at its height at this point as well. And again, you have a resurgent KKK that not only had grown in popularity across the American South, but it grew in popularity across the country. So this was something that was popular as well with women. There was even what was referred to as a WKKK, or Women's Ku Klux Klan. Now, you do have technological developments in the 1920s, that separate from the negativity and the difficulty and the racism of the KKK, that are, again, another part or another way to experience the decade of the 20s. This is a period in which it is becoming increasingly more possible for Americans to purchase cars, and so the Ford Motor Company and its assembly lines, right, are making some of this possible. The price points are making this possible. The ability to purchase this stuff is making this possible. This is the era, of course, of the growth of more longer form car travel for many Americans. It's partly why, if you look at gas stations at the end of the 1920s, some of them are still around today. You can look at sort of images of them. They almost look like, English cottages, kind of, in a way, to give this sort of friendly feel that it's going to be okay, right, to travel in some of these places. This is, of course, the period in which the growth of electrification, this is the period of the growth of, the prominence of telephones becoming even more popular. This is the growth of radio, very much so. This is the time in which vacuums are just starting to be introduced even a bit more. So you're seeing this growth in these sort of standardization of these kinds of technologies that many Americans are going to become far more connected to, radio especially, right? So, by the time you get to the 20s, you got your electrification, you got your radio, you got your telephones, right? That kind of stuff. But radio especially is going to connect people, right? Very, very much so in this decade. And I guess the last thing for us to mention, of course, here is the stock market crash. Now, there are a number of factors, not only throughout the decade of the 1920s, but even before, that had kind of sowed the seeds for this. But by the time you get to 1929 and October of that year and this extreme decline in the stock market, this is going to have reverberations and, of course, what we come to now call the Great Depression. All right. Thank you very much.